Hey everybody, this is Elburz with nVoid Art Tech, and today I want to give you a quick walkthrough of my Escape live show. So as you can see, we've got everything separated into 2 decks of 8 stems each. Stems are basically just parts from my tracks. It could be a bass line, could be an effects part, could be drum lines, anything. This allows me to loop stuff on the fly, make new breakdowns, pull things in and out, and just generally make a new mix of a song. Now I'm controlling all these 16 faders on my iPad, as well as the clip grid, which I'm using to basically maneuver through the set. Now I take all these 16 tracks and I have them summed to 8 sends. Now each pair, so the kick from A and the kick from B, both get summed into their own send. Similarly, you have the snare from A and the snare from B in their own send. You've got the perks from A, the perks from B, the bass from A, the bass from B, etc., all the way across the set. Now I'm using my Korg Nano control to basically control these 8 sends, sort of like my front of house master mix. Each one of these sends also has a special max patch, which basically takes the audio coming through, converts it to OSC, smooths it out, and sends it to whatever my target is. Now I do a lot of work in Max, but I found this one actually on the forums, courtesy of Keith, and I just thought it was so great that I didn't have to sit down and spend time to rebuild it. So if you just go on the forums, look up TD Ableton Sync, you'll find his post and his patch. Now these OSC messages are basically what are driving a lot of the interactivity in our set. Now in the end, I've also got 2 other sends, which are basically just simple effects, 1 delay, 1 reverb, and if I'm doing mixes between songs, I like to throw the tails into a reverb or a delay, and just gives it a cool atmosphere. All my tracks are also color-coded by scenes, and this helps me when I'm looking up really quickly to see where I am and what's coming up next. Now a lot of them also have tempo automation that you can do inside the scenes and live. Now to get that big mastered sound, even when I'm playing live with a lot of stems, I got a simple Ozone 5 maximizer on the master bus, and this just helps glue everything together. Now here we have the Touch Designer master plugin that we run, and this basically takes all our scenes that we're launching out of Ableton and corresponds them to the scenes that we've defined inside of Touch Designer. This is also the plugin where you define your shared faders, but for my set I didn't really need any. Now let's switch over to Touch Designer and I'll give you a quick rundown of what things are going on in there. Now the first thing I set up was just a little monitor window, and you can see when I'm in perform mode I have this perfect little window in the bottom of my screen that I can basically see what's going on. And this just saves me from constantly having to crank my neck around to see either the projections that are behind me or above me or in some obscure place. Now I set this up relatively quickly by making a little window container and then assigning it to the bottom corner of monitor 1 and then just giving it a specific size. Now inside of the show container is basically where we have all the containers that hold all the movies, renderings, and basically anything that happens for each song. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to come to this chart and basically fill in all the cues you plan to have for each song. Now the important thing to note is that these have to be exactly as what you've laid out in your Ableton session on your Touch Designer channel, otherwise they just won't work. Now this next table over here basically controls what happens when you launch the mix out scene. So as you can see, from fall I go to organo, from organo to let go, from let go to fans, and all the way down through my whole set. Now I didn't use any of the faders in Touch, but if you were going to, you'd come here and you'd write them down just the same as anything else. Now if we look over here, I was mentioning earlier that each one of these containers basically corresponds to one of my tracks. So let's take a look inside one. Now as you can see, most of them either have a movie in top or some geometry being rendered, and then I'm affecting a lot of the parameters of either different effects tops or the parameters of the geometry using OSC in chops and select chops. Now the OSC in chops are pretty easy to set up. What you'll want to do is you want to listen on a certain channel that you've set up already and on the port that you've assigned back in Ableton, and you can do this really quickly just by going to the patch, and then you'll just see these 3 parameters here, and you just set localhost if you're on the same computer, or if you have a different IP, you just shoot it at that IP, and then you just come back into Touch Designer and set up the channels that you've already assigned. Now most of the time the messages coming through will need some kind of scaling, so I usually plug them into a math chop right away, and I play with the ranges, and then I usually send that math chop into a lag chop just to smooth things over a little bit. Now it's always good practice that when you're exporting chops, to export them from a null. That way you have just a little checkpoint at the end of each signal path that you can add something before without worrying about trying to rearrange all the export paths, even if you've changed something. Now to really organize what's going on, I have a combination of select chops and math chops. The select chops basically just grab the scene I'm launching in Ableton, and then I use the math chops sort of as gates. So as you'll see here, I'll launch this scene right now. And you'll see that this scene is different than the one that I'm currently looking at in Touch Designer. So once you launch a scene, you get a 1 coming in through the select chop for that specific cue. And when they aren't launched, you get a 0. Now what you can do is you can combine a couple different cues to have the parameters being routed throughout various parts of the track, or just have it set to 1 cue so that something happens at a certain specific point of a track. Now this is really easy to do by just dropping down a select chop and then using the variable $QChans. Now this basically gets all your cues that are attributed to the scene that you're inside of right now, and they're easily selectable, and you can select multiple ones or just one, and you organize it however you like. Now I was mentioning that you can use a math chop in combination with a select chop as a sort of gate. All you have to do is set the combined chops to multiply, and basically what that does is if the select chop is set to 0, the incoming message is multiplied by 0 and basically just stops in its tracks. Now let me show you what happens if I launch that scene now. Now that the scene is launched, you see that we have a 1 coming through the select chop, which means that the parameter gets multiplied by 1 and passes through regularly. Now it's hard to tell from the visual frame rate just as I'm using my backup machine for this recording. Now let me show you another track I have here. Now you can see the layout is fairly similar. We have a combination of OSC in chops and select chops working as gates with math chops, and this basically sets up the structure of my song. And I can have certain effects happening in breakdowns and certain things happening during drops and basically whatever you want. Now all your scenes should have a fade in and a fade out container. Now I usually use a null at the end of any kind of processing just to set up little checkpoints for myself that are easy to manage. But basically you'll want to hook up a select chop to the mix in and the mix out. And for the mix out, all you need is the mix out of that scene. And for the fade in, what you'll want is you'll want the mix out of the scene before it, as well as any cues that are inside of that track. Now I found turning on the async upload to GPU setting on the movie in top to greatly increase performance all around throughout the set. So that's basically the overview of how I use Touch Designer in Ableton for my live escape show. So if you want more information or you want to check out more previews, head on over to Elburz.ca or nVoid.ca. I got links in the description, as well as a big thanks to Beeple for a lot of his great video footage that you can grab for free online. Enjoy!